Hey there, friends. I'm recording this before the debate on Wednesday night in Miami, Republican presidential debate number 3 at 8 p.m. I will be hosting a debate watching party. We've done that twice. If you somehow hear this before 8 p.m. on Wednesday, the 8th of November, then join me. If you're a paid subscriber, you'll get the link along with this show, and I hope to see you there. Now, if you're listening after Wednesday night, then I'm sorry for wasting the last 30 seconds of your time, and I will personally return that somehow to you in any way that you see fit. I've got a great conversation with Tim Wise joining me. He is always great, and I love this discussion as much as I always love talking with Tim. That begins at about 31 minutes after a very robust, comprehensive recap of reactions from across the political spectrum on yesterday's off-year elections. But let's get right to it. What are the takeaways from last night's election? I do want to just mention first that here locally, we really got beaten bad, and it has been a brutal day for those of us here in the Clarkstown, New York Democrats, because we worked so hard, especially the candidates, knocked on thousands of doors, did everything right. We didn't have nearly the money they did. They were taking out ads on Hulu and YouTube, which is very effective, apparently. I don't know why, because I don't know where these old people are seeing them, but we did all we could to turn people out and came up very short. We maintained 1 of 5 seats on the town board. We did win the majority in the county legislature, which does matter, but our local town group, Clarkstown, New York, as hard as we worked, as great as our candidates were, and they really were great, came up short. And it's tough. I mean, you look at the rest of the country and you see all these big wins, but I heard from at least one listener, Kathy Nathan, who's a school board member out in Minnesota, who said they came up short on a very important initiative out there for their school board funding. They're going to have to cut teachers. So it wasn't all great. And local politics is so important, but you don't hear as much about it because we watch so much of our national media and local media just doesn't pay. So covering local politics is a very, very hard thing to do and sustain with any kind of responsibility and accuracy. Nobody seemed to come up with the model to be able to fund it anymore. And so we don't pay as much attention to it, but I beg you, I urge you to pay attention as much as you can and to get involved with local organizers and activists, from your Moms Demand groups to your Working Families groups to your progressive and democratic groups and local NAACP and local women's rights groups, you name it. There are so many different folks and groups that you can get involved with, make new friends, and be the change that you want to see. And as much as we came up short, we'll keep trying here, and I hope you will wherever you are in your local districts, counties, and obviously statewide. All right, let me read a little bit from the great Heather Cox Richardson's Letters from an American recapping Election Day. Across the country, a number of key state elections, voters rejected the extremism of MAGA Republicans and backed Democrats and Democratic policies. 4 of the most closely watched races were in Ohio, Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. In Ohio, voters enshrined the right of individuals to make their own health care decisions, including the right to abortion, into the state constitution. Opponents of abortion rights have worked hard since the summer to stop the measure from passing, trying first to make it more difficult to amend the Constitution. Voters overwhelmingly rejected that measure in an August special election. Then, by blanketing the state with disinformation about the measure, including through official state websites and with ads by former Fox News channel personality Tucker Carlson, and finally by dropping 26,000 voters from the rolls. I did not know that they did that. They dropped 26,000 voters from the rolls, and they still won in Ohio, the pro-woman vote, I'll call it. Heather Cox Richardson says none of it worked. Voters protected the right to abortion. Since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision recognizing the constitutional right to abortion in June 2022, voters in all 7 state elections where the issue was on the ballot had fought back to protect abortion rights. And last night's vote in Ohio, where the end of Roe v. Wade resurrected an extreme anti-abortion bill, well, guess what, folks? That makes it 8. Now let's head over to Virginia, where abortion was also on the ballot. Their entire state legislature was up for grabs yesterday. Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin made it clear he wanted to control the legislature in order to push through a measure banning abortion after 15 weeks. This ploy, Cox Richardson says, was one Republicans were using to seem to soften their anti-abortion stance, which has proven terribly unpopular. Youngkin was taking the idea out for a spin to see how it might play in a presidential election, perhaps with the hope of entering the Republican race for the presidential nomination as someone who could have claimed to have turned a blue state red. Well, it didn't work. Voters recognized that it was disingenuous to call a 15-week limit a compromise on the abortion issue, since most serious birth defects are not even detected until 20 weeks into pregnancy. Now, going into the election, Democrats held the state Senate in Virginia, but rather than giving Youngkin control over both houses of state legislature, voters left Democrats in charge of the Senate and flipped the House of Delegates over to the Democrats. Democrats are expected to elevate House Minority Leader Don Scott of Portsmouth to the speakership, making him the first black House Speaker in Virginia history. And Virginia voters also elevated Delegate Danica Rome, who's been on this show, the first known transgender delegate to the state Senate. At the same time, voters in Loudoun County, which had become a hotspot in culture wars with attacks on LGBTQ plus individuals, and with activists insisting the schools must not teach critical race theory, rejected that extremism and turned control of the school board over to those who champion diversity and equity. And my understanding is, and it's hard to know because there doesn't seem to be necessarily a warehouse of information on these Moms for Liberty school board types that have tried to gain control using anything from vaccine mandates to critical race theory and obviously to all things LGBT. Nowhere to find out how well they did, but it seems like they continue to lose with those messages. That's my understanding, according to Greg Sargent over at the Washington Post, who said the big victory in Virginia isn't just about abortion. It also shows the reactionary, quote, parental rights nonsense has utterly fizzled. He said, I talked to Democrats on the ground about how the right is alienating voters and wrote a whole piece about it at the Washington Post, which I highly recommend. But the headline is Glenn Youngkin's disastrous night shows the right's culture war has fizzled. And I would love to believe that. And finally, let's go over to Kentucky, where Heather Cox Richardson writes, voters reelected Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, who was running against Republican State Attorney General Daniel Cameron, a defender of Kentucky's abortion ban. Cameron was also the Attorney General who declined to bring charges against the law enforcement officers who killed Breonna Taylor in her bed in 2020 after breaking into her apartment in a mistaken search for drugs, an absolutely horrific crime that got not only headlines in Kentucky, but all over the country, probably the world. And finally, in Pennsylvania, Democrat Daniel McCaffrey won a Supreme Court seat, enabling Democrats in Pennsylvania to increase their majority on the Supreme Court. Daniel McCaffrey positioned himself as a defender of abortion rights. How about that? And one final takeaway that Heather Cox Richardson points to political analyst Tom Bonnier, who said, my biggest takeaway from tonight, in 2022, abortion rights had the biggest impact where it was literally on the ballot. Less so when trying to draw the connection in candidate races. Well, that has changed. Voters clearly made the connection that voting for Republican candidates equals abortion bans. And I say, let's keep that impression going wherever Republicans are winning congressional elections or anything else. So that's from Heather Cox Richardson, whose newsletter I, like millions of others, subscribe to. But yeah, the big takeaway, since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which recognized the constitutional right to abortion in June of 2022, voters in all 7 states' elections where the issue is on the ballot have fought back to protect abortion rights, and Ohio made it 8. So that's the big takeaway I'm seeing, and I'm sure you are as well. Greg Sargent again writes, last night's results exposed the absurdity of so much of our punditry, which is often premised on the bizarre suggestion that on some fundamental level, Trump and the MAGA-fed GOP are winning, as if they haven't actually been repudiated by voters again and again in the Trump era. Ben Wickler on the issue of marijuana becoming legalized in Ohio writes, let's be blunt. Marijuana smoked in Ohio. The ballot initiative rolled to victory by a cushy margin. A joint effort by groups and the grassroots. And this issue doesn't just blaze in Ohio. It's chronic. Everywhere this seed is planted, you can see the buds flowering. I just thought that was so poetic. I wanted to share that reaction with you. And as a reaction to the Kentucky governor winning, making it more likely, possibly, I guess, actuarially, that he would appoint a senator if Mitch McConnell died during his term here, because he's the Democratic governor in Kentucky, and they can apparently appoint a senator to fill a seat. Somebody tweeted, is it too much to hope that for the last words McConnell hears as he dies in agony from Andy Beshear whispering, I'm appointing a black lesbian to your seat? And Elie Mystal drove the stake even deeper when he referred to that and said, this just made me imagine Governor Andy Beshear leaning over McConnell's deathbed like Sophie Marceau in Braveheart, whispering to an incapacitated Longshanks. Remember that scene? All right, that's evil Schadenfreude, and I will not partake in it. Anthony Michael Kreese at Georgia State University, Eric Siegel's colleague, says yesterday's election saw major successes for liberals on state courts and constitutions. The Ohio Constitution gets an express abortion right. Virginia Democrats have complete control of the judicial selection process, and Pennsylvania Democrats maintained a 4-2 Democratic majority on the Supreme Court there in Pennsylvania. Amanda Lippman at Run for Something said it was a really bad night for Moms for Liberty, which means a really great night for students and teachers. And you already heard my big takeaway, which was what about locally? How did we do locally? So that is some of the things I just wanted to mention and read. There's so much more. Of course, I'm sure you've seen and heard it all. I'd love to hear your takeaways, and maybe you can share them with me at the Hangout on Thursday night, or maybe tonight if you're listening on Thursday the 9th. 8 p.m. for all subscribers. I want to hear from you, but now I want to play for you. Here comes the audio, everybody. Several clips, reactions, and takeaways to last night's election, and then I think I've got one clip not related to it from Eric Swalwell trolling Jim Jordan at the House Oversight hearing yesterday. Very, very good. I'll save that for last. But first, let's get to some of the reactions from Democrats, starting with the Vice President of the United States of America, Kamala Harris. She spoke to some reporters outside the White House, had this to say.
And by extension, it was a good night for democracy. I think that if you look at from the midterms to last night, from California to Kansas, Ohio to Virginia, the voters said, look, the government should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. I think voters have been clear, regardless of whether they're in a so-called red or blue state, that one does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree the government should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. And so it was a good night, and the president and I obviously have a lot of work to do to earn our re-election, but I am confident we're going to win. So thank you all.
All right, that is, of course, the vice president yesterday, and also let's listen to his spokesman, the president's spokeswoman, that is Karine Jean-Pierre, and the White House briefing yesterday.
President Biden's values and agenda won big across the country last night. In Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and in Virginia, voters once again sided with President Biden's agenda to stand up for fundamental freedoms and build an economy for the middle class and protect democracy. Now let's turn to Ohio for a second. On the heels of an attempt to weaken voters' voices at the ballot box in August, the people of Ohio voted decisively last night to make reproductive care a constitutional right in their state. Ohio is now the 7th state where voters turned out in droves to reject attempts by Republican elected officials to impose extreme abortion bans since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And from Kentucky to Virginia to Pennsylvania, voters in those states also turned out to roundly reject abortion bans that jeopardize the health and the lives of women, force women to travel hundreds of miles for care, and threaten to criminalize doctors and nurses. The stakes could not have been higher. And last night, voters sent a very, very clear message. We have always said that voting matters and polls do not. Our focus is going to remain on our work to grow the economy, lower costs for families, and protect fundamental freedoms against dangerous agendas that are out of touch with the American people.
All right, and now let's get one more from a Democratic leader. This is the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor yesterday. His reaction to the election outcomes.
There is no possible takeaway from last night other than this. Americans fiercely oppose MAGA extremism, fiercely oppose total abortion bans, and want bipartisan leaders who can put America's needs first. After last night's results, I have a message to my Republican colleagues. When the MAGA agenda can't win in deep red Kentucky or in Ohio or help you in Virginia, it's time to recognize MAGA extremism is the wrong answer, not just for the country, but even for the GOP. I hope Republicans in Congress see that after last night, extremism must be rejected and bipartisanship embraced.
All right, there's Chuck Schumer, and now let's go to CNN's Kate Baldwin, who had the re-elected governor of Kentucky, Democrat Andy Beshear, on her program on CNN yesterday.
Governor, when you hear people say that your re-election and the way you ran your campaign provides a blueprint for how Democrats should be running elsewhere and across the country, do you agree?
Well, I think our blueprint was as simple as show up, work hard, get results, and care about everybody. And don't get distracted by whatever the issue of the day is in Washington, D.C. Now, when people wake up in the morning, they don't think about President Biden or President Trump. They think about, do they have a good enough job? Can they afford to take their kids or their parents to a doctor when they're sick? Do they feel safe in their community? Are their kids getting the best education? Is the road they drive on to work safe? Does it need repairs? Those are the things that impact everybody's daily lives. And I hope that not just Democrats, but Republicans and independents go there. You know, enough of trying to demonize groups of people, of driving a wedge between people, of the attacks and the anger. How about we all talk about how to improve people's lives, and then the electorate can decide who has the better plan or the better ideas or who they trust more to move them forward.
All right. I don't know if he really said anything in that clip of consequence. I'm not sure he quite answered the question, but let's get one more from one more Democrat, and then I'll get some reaction from Republican conservatives, Fox News types. This is Simone Sanders Townsend, former senior advisor, chief spokesperson for Kamala Harris.
Issues, it is the message, but we cannot negate the messenger. Like, it is Joe Biden that my one criticism of the whole messaging situation is branding it Bidenomics, because I don't think people understand what Bidenomics is. And what they do understand is when you just tell them what they're getting. And that's what Joe Biden did today or yesterday when he announced the $16 billion for rail. He just told them what they were getting. That is Bidenomics, but they didn't call it Bidenomics. And I think that's what needs to happen. That's what Andy Beshear did tonight. He talked about Bidenomics, the battery production facilities,
prescription drug
prices, all of those things. And so I actually think the folks who, I think a lot of people owe Joe Biden an apology today because, honey, I watched the news. I was sitting on some of the panels. The people had very critical words for the president. He need to drop out. I don't know.
All right, there you go. That is Simone Sanders Townsend. Let's get some reaction from right-wing conservatives, Republicans, media types. Here is the former senator from Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, who should probably not use the phrase secret sauce, admitting he doesn't love direct democracy. He was on one of the only places that'll still have him, Newsmax.
And you put very sexy things like abortion and marijuana on the ballot, and a lot of young people come out and vote. It was a secret sauce for disaster in Ohio. I don't know what they were thinking, but that's why I thank goodness that most of the states in this country don't allow you to put everything on the ballot, because pure democracies are not the way to run a country.
So then you're...
Pure democracies are not the way to run a country. And he also insinuated abortion was a sexy issue. Okay. Yeah. And marijuana, super sexy. All right. Well, here is Hannity saying the quiet part out loud.
Democrats demagogue the issue very effectively.
They're trying to scare, Democrats are trying to scare women into thinking Republicans don't want abortion legal under any circumstances.
No, we're not doing that. You're doing that. You don't. And you're trying to say that that's not the case, but it is the case, and you know it, and you're trying to walk it back somehow, but you can't. And that's why Democrats keep winning where that issue is at stake. And listen to this from the Fox and Friends.
Yeah, a lot at stake. In Virginia, that was really a loss for the governor. And he traveled all over that state to all the different districts. They spent a ton of money trying to get the Republicans to win in both of those establishments, but the no abortion ban. I think that's what the voters said. What did he want, Brian? He wanted 18 weeks. Is that right, the governor?
16, I think 15 weeks. 15. And he also said, flip the House, keep the Senate. But he lost both. What an epic failure by Governor Youngkin. This is a huge loss for him, who everyone looked at, if not 24, which I thought was a long shot, definitely 28.
But that's a tough state to win in, though, because you have equal amount amount of Republicans and Democrats. And when we went there, when Governor Youngkin was running, I remember people were really angry. They did not want him to win on the Democratic side. We were standing outside of a grocery store asking people as they came out, either they loved him or they were completely against him.
Well, Virginia, for the most part, has been a bluish state, and it just got a lot bluer. And, the number one most motivating factor was the issue of abortion in the Commonwealth of Virginia, because while Glenn Youngkin was trying to come up with a moderate approach, let's say 15 weeks, and then it would be a ban. And we should point out that wasn't on the agenda. That wasn't actually on the ballot. But, if you elect all these Republicans, I can get this done. It seemed like a moderate thing. But unfortunately for him, the people very loudly said, you know what, not interested in that, Lawrence.
Yeah, it doesn't look like the ground game worked. Doesn't look like the early voting initiative that they said they were doing there worked. And it was a big upset there. Let's go to Ohio.
No, let's not. Let's just comment quickly on the fact that Ducey said that a 15-week ban sounds like a moderate thing. Only in Ducey's world. Only in the world where people would live somewhere on the fringe, on the extremities of the Overton window, would you say that's moderate? Yeah, on the far right extreme on women's reproductive rights, I guess a 15-week ban is moderate. What an absurd thing to say. But you know what? Let's get back to the absurdity on Fox and Friends, because there's more.
The thing is important is they didn't message crime. They didn't message the border. They have not touched the inner city.
They didn't do nearly enough race baiting, apparently, according to Kilmeade.
So whatever people are, however the mayors are failing, however the issues are falling short, whether it's the bail reform or whether it's the lack of police officers on the street.
They didn't talk at all about keeping black people in line and in cages.
Nothing was emphasized or matters as much as that, or people are just staying home. Yeah. The Republicans have a lot to work with. They're just not working with it.
Well, but ultimately it comes down to the Democrats have a really potent issue, and that is abortion, because
women like having rights.
Ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned, pretty much every time the Democrats have run on abortion, they have won. And here's the bad, and was last night a harbinger for 2024, as you were alluding to, Ainsley? Absolutely. You know why? Because there are opponents and proponents trying to put abortion rights on the ballots in the states of Florida, Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. So it's going to be, if you're a Republican running in those states, you're going to have a tough 2024.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I didn't realize that was happening, or that was the effort or initiative. But yeah, great. I'm glad that's happening. If they're going to put abortion rights actually on the ballot as a possible referendum to vote on, it will turn people out, and it will help them vote up and down the ticket. And the final clip from Fox and Friends, they asked in a poll about how important the issue of abortion was.
Was extremely or very important, and only 32% said that it was moderate or not important.
It's nearly 7 in 10. Republicans have to figure out what their messaging is, like Brian was saying, in order to go forward in the next election. We looked at this midterm election as a way to gauge how Republicans or how Democrats react going forward for 2024. So Republicans need to look at all of these numbers and really think about what's more important. Yes, most people that are Republicans are probably pro-life, and we love our babies, and I love being a mother.
Oh, those of us that are pro-choice actually don't love our babies or love being parents. So Ainsley's got us there.
But what's most important? Republicans taking over and Republicans being able to keep our country.
Well, the other thing,
I mean, it doesn't make any sense. She's not smart. I'm sorry. None of them are. I mean, Ducey's an idiot, and Kilmeade's even the dumbest, but probably makes some good, well, not good points, but arguments. All right, they're all just really, really dumb. The point that she says there at the end, that it's most important that Republicans win, that Republicans take back our country. I mean, just every once in a while, it's worth reminding people that they still pretend to be a news station, that they still pretend to be fair and balanced, but they're openly always rooting for Republicans to win elections. And I suppose that's probably true in MSNBC at some points, but nothing is more nakedly partisan than Fox and Friends and Fox News in general. And the only network, if you want to call it that, more partisan, well, I guess there's a couple, but is the right-wing Newsmax. And here is the conversation, a quick, I don't think I've rarely played clips from Newsmax, but here is their reaction. They had Ken Cuccinelli and whatever right-wing anchor that is formerly on release for domestic abuse was hosting this segment.
As far as, it does seem like the Republican Party generally has a real problem with winning. It certainly was in the midterms here and now in this one as well. And you wonder, do we have the right people in place to be putting the messaging together to the people that are supposed to be there to get the early vote out, to do these jobs? You wonder about the RNC. Do we have the right people running the show? Because we're not doing something right. I think that's very obvious.
Problems with winning.
Yeah, Rob, I think you're right in a lot of places. I would say these state level races, RNC doesn't really play a role in voter turnout. That's run by the team on the ground, and that in Virginia is led by Glenn Youngkin, and he made an admirable effort to push more Republicans to get out earlier and vote, with the ultimate goal of having more people voting for Republican candidates. But it's not been enough.
They're getting sober over on Newsmax. Let's go to one more clip on this CNN. Abby Phillips talking to Chris Christie, who's running for president.
Very red state, the state of Kentucky, the Democratic incumbent. He beat a rising star in your party, Daniel Cameron. Cameron was also notably endorsed by Trump. He was embraced by him and embraced Trump himself. Was that a mistake on his part?
Daniel Cameron was a rising star in the Republican Party until he decided to throw his lot in with Donald Trump. I mean, let's face it, Donald Trump is political and electoral poison down ballot. Down ballot, his endorsement has led to Republican defeats in the House, in the Senate rather, and the House in 18. In 20, we lost the United States Senate and the White House. In 22, we underperformed miserably. And tonight, you're seeing us lose again. Daniel Cameron made a huge mistake by embracing Donald Trump and selling his soul to him. That's what he did. And the voters of Kentucky, very red state, as you noted, gave their verdict on politicians who sell their soul to Donald Trump.
All right, there you go. That is my wrap-up of last night's elections. A whole bunch of commentary and clips. Hope you appreciated that. Took a lot of work to put into it. So sign up for a subscription right now. I'm a one-man independent media outlet doing my best to inform, enlighten, at times entertain, live, laugh, and learn along with you here on Stand Up. So thank you very much for joining me. But I do have one more clip before we get to my conversation with Tim Wise. This is Eric Swalwell yesterday. Trolling is probably not giving enough credit to what he's doing here to the House Oversight Committee Chairman, Jim Jordan. I don't think you really need too much of a context, but here it is from Eric Swalwell yesterday, the congressman from California.
So what I'm concerned about is that we have anti-Semitic posts coming from this committee. And last October, the chairman tweeted out on October 6th, Kanye, Elon, Trump. Those 5 statements that I just read to you were from Kanye West, who had made a number of anti-Semitic statements before this tweet was put up, and then made the DEFCON statement about a day after the tweet was put up. I, the chairman at the time, Chairman Nadler, many people in the Jewish community asked the chairman, Chairman Jordan, to take this down. And it wasn't just members of Congress. It was nonpartisan Jewish organizations who said, Kanye West is anti-Semitic. I don't know what you're doing, but please do not give him a platform by leaving this tweet up. It stayed up for months. Defiantly, the chairman kept this tweet up. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to be just today your accountability partner, your online accountability partner, and just go through your social media. Because if we're going to have a hearing about anti-Semitism, we can't allow a tweet like this to be posted on our side or your side. In 2019, Chairman Jordan also tweeted at Tom Steyer and used the $ for Steyer to spell his name. Again, known Jewish philanthropist playing into what Ms. Burdett mentioned earlier, tropes about Jewish people and money. So this committee should have a conversation and a hearing about anti-Semitism. But I would first insist that the chairman, I don't know why he put this tweet up. Either he believes it, which I hope is not the case, or he just wanted to own the libs. And if that's what you're doing, you're hurting a lot of people by keeping that tweet up for so long, especially knowing what it represents. And if we're talking about being your online accountability partner, Chairman, you still have a subpoena in your inbox that's about 500 days old.
Oh, so good. So good by Congressman Eric Swalwell. All right. Well, that's it. That's all I've got for you. And the wrap up. Tell your friends that nobody does it better than Stand Up with Pete Dominic from his solar-powered shed, or whatever you want to tell them. But tell them to listen. Please spread the word. All right, let's get to my conversation now with Tim Wise. He's an anti-racist writer and speaker and educator. He's written several books and hundreds of amazing essays over the years. He has joined me very regularly, at least once a month here on the program. Probably do I reach out to Tim Wise, who's also become a pretty good friend of mine over the past couple of years, especially. And I talked with Tim the day before the election, so there's a couple of references to it, but I thought it was really relevant and important because we talked about that shooter in Tennessee, the trans woman who killed, I think, 6 people, 3 kids, 3 adults out there at the end of the conversation. And that part of it was, I think, really very important to get his perspective. But I started with talking about the importance of democracy, the arguments about voter ID that you hear this time of year, off-year elections and why they matter, polling and strategy and why it does and doesn't matter, and a lot more. Tim is always on fire, one of your favorite guests, and I was so happy that we got to sit down and have this conversation. As always, you can support him on social media. He's still very active on Twitter and on Patreon. You can support him in many other ways. Send him some money. Send him some support. Thank him for joining us. Let's do it right now with the amazing, the brilliant Tim Wise. All right, he's one of your all-time favorites, of course, one of mine. Tim Wise joins me now. I don't know, Tim, when I post this on Election Day or after Election Day, just to give people a heads up of the timing. We probably don't, well, we don't know the results. But thank you for joining me. A lot I want to talk to you about voting and democracy and much more. Hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I have several issues I want to get to with you. I just got in an argument with a neighbor of mine, I suppose, who actually know the guy, on Facebook about voter ID. He suggested people bring their ID, and I simply informed him that that was not required. But I thought I would ask you to give us a reminder of the history of voter suppression and where this voter ID idea comes from here on Election Day and why it's actually not necessary.
Well, I mean, if you look at where the push for voter ID begins and when it begins, I think it's pretty instructive, right? The reality is we had elections in this country for generations where no one was expected to produce an ID. And the reason was that of all the crimes that you could possibly commit, election fraud has got to be the stupidest crime that you can commit. First off, it's punishable by jail time, and people have gone to jail in those instances where they've committed it. It's just very rare. Why would you do that in any large numbers for the sake of casting a vote? It's not like you're going to think to yourself, gosh, if I can just vote twice or maybe 3 times, my guy's going to win. Elections are very rarely, if ever, decided by that number of votes. And so it's just a very high cost crime for a very low payoff.
I would just submit there's no payoff.
There's virtually none. I mean, really, what is the payoff? And most of the instances that you've heard that have actually happened, of course, haven't had anything to do with people not having an ID. It's usually people voting for their dead mother who they swear told them, please vote for Trump. I need another vote for Trump. And it's always those people.
Is that your dead mother ghost impersonation?
Yes, it's always these old white people in the villages, right, who are in between their orgies that they have with the other old white people.
God bless them.
They go and vote 3 times, and sit around and drink margaritas or whatever they do. So
it does happen, and it's almost always Republicans. But even then, it doesn't affect the outcome of any local state.
And it's almost never because of a lack of ID that it happens. It's usually absentee voter fraud. It doesn't happen much even there, but that's much easier, right? Absentee voters. But for years, Republicans didn't mind absentee voting because it was usually their people who were voting that way, right? It was businessmen on a junket to Japan and they needed to cast a vote before they left the country or whatever. Look, the bottom line is this. It's not that voter fraud doesn't happen, but the hysteria over election fraud begins when? After the election of Barack Obama. Prior to that, it's like all of a sudden everybody's cheating because the black guy won. There must be something wrong. And the black guy won a second time. There really must be something wrong. So all of a sudden you begin to see this push for voter identification, primarily in quote unquote red states, right wing states, the old Confederate states, southern states. And it's not because of any substantial fraud in those areas. And in fact, in most of those areas, you know, their guy was winning, and it usually was their guy. It was usually conservatives winning, but they still were trying to make this argument. I think part of it was a way to demonize the growing electorate of color and to essentially suggest these people aren't real Americans. They are trying to steal the country from you. It's part of their larger rhetoric, right? That immigrants are coming in to steal your tax dollars, and black people are stealing your jobs because of affirmative action, or your kid's slot at Yale, or whatever it is they think is being stolen. And so the idea of stolen elections is just one more part of the criminalization narrative of black and brown folks. They also don't like it when young people vote very much, because young people trend far more democratic and far more progressive in their politics. So they want to have ID, but only certain kinds of ID. You can't use your college ID. You know, they won't let you use that. But in places like Texas, they would let you use your gun license registration. You know, so if you're a gun owner, you could take that ID in. But if you're a college student, no, not so much. So it's just hypocritical. It's inconsistent. It's transparently disingenuous. And it's not that it's necessarily wrong to say that maybe we ought to have ID, but if you're going to ask people to have ID to vote, then you should make sure that you provide it to them free of charge and make it easy to get one. And right now it's not. You know, there have been studies, I think the Brennan Center did a study on this several years ago that found that the overall opportunity cost for a person who doesn't have ID to get ID ends up being like $150, $160. And some people might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, $150 or $160 is a big deal if you are struggling economically, and who's going to be disproportionately struggling economically.
Well, the idea that the conservative right wants to create a government problem to solve an issue that doesn't exist. They're actually creating bureaucracy. These IDs do cost something to create. Right. Maybe it's not much, but the point is, why would you, if you were conservative, you want less government? Are you creating more government for a problem that doesn't exist? But Tim, they'll tell you, you need an ID to buy liquor and cigarettes. Why shouldn't you need an ID to vote?
Well, there was never a movement to ensure the right to buy cigarettes or vape pens. There was never a movement that's not considered a fundamental right or a fundamental entitlement that people have. The ability to vote is something people have literally fought and died for. So perhaps the standards ought to be a little different than whether I can get, a wine cooler or whatever the kids drink instead of wine coolers nowadays. I know that's a very dated reference. I don't even know they make those anymore. But the point is, it's not a significant enough problem to justify. But here's the thing. If you impose a voter ID requirement, knowing that it's going to take some people, it's going to be too expensive. The $150 may not be much, but it's more than the poll tax was. And the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. Right. But you know that if you put that obstacle in the way, that there will be some number, maybe it won't be huge, but there will be some number that will not get their ID and would be kept from voting. And what these folks are thinking is, on the margins, that can tip the balance. That's why they're doing it. It's why in North Carolina, when the state legislature was pushing their version of this, they specifically asked the attorney general, maybe it was the election officials in the state, but they asked the election officials, what are the IDs that black people are most likely to have and least likely to have, right? They literally, the court in initially tossing out that plan said that they had focused on black voters with laser-like precision, right? Ultimately trying to make sure that whatever the ID was that black folks were less likely to have, that was the one you needed. And the one that white folks were more likely to have, that's the one you gotta have.
Sometimes people I can hear, because I'm trying to think of this with the ears of the right wingers who I argue with in Facebook to try to make the arguments. But people will say, oh, of course he's going to race. They said it. There's tons of records of saying the reason why we want to do this voter ID thing is because it will make harder for black people to vote. They said it. It has come, journalists, investigative journalists have found these different documents. I forget where, but they stated the reason for it, right? In
North Carolina, they clearly took steps that were obviously about that. Now, in other states, they'll say, in Texas, they said, we're not trying to keep black people and Latinos. We're just trying to keep Democrats. They admitted that in court.
And fair enough, young people, all the people who are likely to vote for Democrat will make
technically excluding people through, whether it's through gerrymandering or various requirements based on party affiliation, is oddly not considered unconstitutional by many in the judiciary. So that's weird, but it is true. You can do that if it's a partisan gerrymander versus a racial one, it's okay. If it's a partisan policy that's going to disproportionately affect Democrats, it's considered okay. But here's the thing, and this is where the courts need to step in and be a little bit more, not even creative, just honest. And that is to say, if you have two parties in this country that have drifted racially in terms of who is in which party, especially in certain states. In states like Texas, the Democratic Party is overwhelmingly going to be black and brown, right? And the Republican Party is going to overwhelmingly be white, as is the case in most of the so-called red states. So if you're having a policy that you know is going to disproportionately harm Democrats, you ought to be held accountable for that in terms of the disparate impact that it has on the people who you know full well are disproportionately represented in the party. That's the jurisprudential standard we ought to have. We ought to have a standard of foreseeable impact, right? Like if you have a policy, the obvious and foreseeable impact of which is to disproportionately restrict the opportunities, rights, and privileges of certain people based on race and nationality and gender and all these things, that shouldn't be allowed constitutionally. Sadly, we have a court that hasn't made that move yet, but they should.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, Bartles and James. I'm trying to think of the other one that used
California
to be
Cooler, Bartles and James, Sun Country. Should I go on? I remember all of them. Yeah.
It is about just these off-year elections, as they call them. Talk to me about some of the things that you think, are important, go undercovered, and if there's any ballot initiatives or races that you're watching or thinking about. Of course, I'm very involved locally, so I've got all these local town offices, but I'm also watching across the country about these parents' rights groups, these Moms for Liberties groups, these right-wing anti-gay, racist groups that are fighting to take control of and have in many cases, unfortunately, too many, and many boards of education across the country. But what, if anything, are you paying attention to? What do you want to say about these local elections, these off-year elections?
Well, the school board elections are obviously really important. Now, the good news is last year, a lot of those Moms for Liberty candidates and those right-wing candidates really flamed out compared to what they were expecting. They didn't do nearly as well as was being expected. So hopefully that trend will continue, and we'll see. I mean, obviously they are very well organized. They are very well financed, but we'll see what happens. We just had a race down here in Franklin, which is, a conservative sort of bedroom community town right outside of Nashville. And, there was a woman running for mayor, super MAGA-fied candidate, connected to local white supremacist organizations. The Proud Boys and others were providing her security. She denied all of this. She was blatantly transphobic, homophobic, heterosexist, flirting with white nationalists in the most obvious way. And the good people of Franklin, who frankly, no pun intended when I say that, but who have frankly gone along with way too much right-wing nonsense over the years and laid the groundwork for her candidacy, did in fact reject her by like 4-1.
Franklin incumbent mayor Ken Moore wins in landslide after hostile race in Franklin, Tennessee. And I don't know if you saw it, but John Oliver did put her on the map with his show. It was
hilarious. His 20 minutes on her was absolutely
amazing.
And Phil Williams, who is the investigative journalist here with the CBS affiliate, did a great job of exposing her connections. And so the people, what that election told me, and I think a lot of us down here, is that even though you've got a lot of ultra conservative people in Williamson County and Franklin who went to the polls during that election, I mean, it is an overwhelmingly Trump community.
Wow.
And yet they rejected this person 4-1. And what that tells me, which is really the important, I think, thing for people to think about in this so-called off-year election moving in then to next year's election, is that when you draw a clear distinction between the extremism of the far-right candidates, whether they are running for local office or state office or for the presidency, and those of us who believe in small d democracy, even if we have disagreements about what that ought to look like, whether we're on the left or the right or in the middle somewhere, there are good people on all sides of the political spectrum who are willing to reject that. But you have to draw the stark difference. You can't run away from it. You can't run that campaign against Gabrielle Henson, for instance, or Hanson, whichever you pronounce it, in Franklin. You can't run that campaign against her about who's going to be better for, making the traffic lights work okay, and who's going to be better for trash collection, and who's going to have better policies on this, and this. You have to stigmatize these far right candidates. It's the lesson, and I've talked about it with you many times, that we learned fighting David Duke in 1990 and 91 in Louisiana. You cannot treat extremists like normal candidates. You cannot normalize them by saying, well, what's your plan for broadband internet? What's your plan for trade policy? What's your plan for this, that, and the other? Because that takes an extremist and treats them like a normal person rather than the threat to democracy they are. And I know that there are mainstream Democratic Party consultants who will scream at me for saying that. No, we have to focus on good economic policy and the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. Nobody is paying attention to that shit. And to the extent they are, they don't believe the sales pitch that you have for it, because people still think that inflation is out of control, even though it's coming down. So your ability to change people's perception of their day-to-day reality at the supermarket is a lot harder than to change their perception of the threat posed to small d democracy by these people on the far right. And that election in Franklin, and I think a lot of these elections in Ohio, this abortion vote on this constitutional amendment is going to be really indicative. The state of Kentucky, what's going to happen there? Is Governor Beshear going to be able to hold on and win against a clearly out of touch reactionary candidate running on the Republican side who is in favor of abortion restrictions that the vast majority of Kentuckians say that they reject? That's going to be a bellwether election, I think, going into 2024.
So, yeah, it's going to be really informative, because we're hearing about all these different polls regarding the presidential election next year. Most recently, the New York Times does a poll that has Biden losing in swing states to Donald Trump, that RFK Jr. apparently doing better than both them in swing states or something like that, in either that or another poll. What are your thoughts about polls that come out at this point, and polling in general versus what you just said, the actual outcomes of elections since 2018 have not been great for Republicans nationwide? Obviously, in certain places where they're really MAGA, but overwhelmingly, you could argue the polls have gotten it wrong. What are your thoughts?
I mean, polling is more art than science, and in the last several election cycles, the art has become decidedly muddled. And maybe it's the kind of art you hang on the fridge when your kid does it when they're 4. It's not the kind that you frame. You know what I mean? And that's not to say that this poll might not be correct, but polls that are a year out are pretty notoriously bad. They are also bad in the sense that they don't take into consideration, or they do, but they're buried deep in the crosstabs, various things that might change those outcomes. So, for instance, that poll also, at least one of those polls that came out, shows that if there's even one indictment of Donald Trump, even one, and he could get several, right? But if there's even one, then he loses all those swing states. You don't mean indictments. He's already been indicted. One guilty. Not indictments. If he's actually convicted. If he is convicted on any of these counts that he's facing, that those very same swing states that he's supposedly going to win, now he won't. So there are a lot of things in play that make it really difficult to make this kind of assessment that somehow Donald Trump is going to beat Joe Biden. I also think the problem is right now, to whatever extent there's any credibility to that polling, it is because the Democrats have not been able to decide on what their message is. What is their message? Their message is, the Bidenomics is working. Well, listen, I know that it's working better than most people know that it's working. I realize inflation is coming down. I realize that the job numbers generally have looked really good. But the truth of the matter is the state of the economy in the modern era is more about perception than whatever the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Commerce Department or anyone else can point to. So if you're going to sit there and hang your hat on the idea that you people are just too stupid to know what a great manager of the economy I am, I assure you that is not a winning message, because that is a message that says to the people, you're not smart enough to understand what a genius my administration has been. The message needs to be, no, it's not about that. You may be hurting. You may be doing well. We're all hurting. But here's what is scarier than whatever it is we face right now is the prospect of the eradication of democracy if this individual who tried to overthrow the government once gets in power with a Speaker of the House who also tried to help him steal it the last time. That's much scarier. We have to be talking about the freedoms of American people being under attack, the liberties and opportunities of the American people being under attack. Because if that's the message, then a lot of those people who are worried about inflation, understandably worried about the state of the economy, worried about the affordability of college, worried about the affordability of healthcare, will understand that none of those things are going to get addressed if small d democracy itself is undermined. None of those things are going to be addressed if Donald Trump wins, but people need to be reminded that that is the situation we face Not a matter of, does this person have the best policy on taxes? Does this person have the best policy on how to fix the roads and the bridges? Democrats have a policy wonk fixation. We are so fixated, people on the left in particular, with the minutia and the detail of public policy. And that worked back in the 90s, right? That worked for Bill Clinton. Because back in the 90s, you didn't have 24-hour news cycles and social media where you could have complete, bad intended players putting out nonsense and memes and hateful rhetoric and trying to galvanize people on the basis of emotion the same way that you have that now.
Yes, that can so easily take a policy that's so effective, it's literally helping everyone, and make it sound like it's the devil's gulch.
Right. And so you just can't play the game the way all these people that are still stuck on Jim Carball's "it's the economy, stupid" argument don't understand that even when it is the economy, it is the economy in a symbolic way far more than anything else. So, for instance, when Trump won the first time and people said these are economic anxiety voters, it's not that that was totally wrong. Some of them were, but their economic anxiety was symbolic, and it was filtered through the fear that those people are taking my job. Those people are coming across the border and stealing economic opportunity. In other words, it was economics layered on top of culture, layered on top of a perceived threat or a diminution of prior power and privilege and position. Right. And unless we speak directly to that, and Biden has the capacity to speak to that. He has the capacity to speak to it, as do other Democrats. The problem is I see these Democrats in his administration and in the consulting class get on television and talk about how we're going to talk about Inflation Reduction Act, and we're going to talk about the infrastructure legislation, and we're going to talk about all these great policy things that we're going to implement. And I'm sorry, that's just not what most people nowadays are voting on. They are voting on the basis of emotional appeals to, these sort of very divisive issues. And so I think Democrats have got to be clear that there is an existential threat that we face. And that means we don't have to get in the dirt calling people names and saying you all are all awful people and we're the good people. There are a lot of good people, including a lot of good Republicans and a lot of independents who know that the existential threat has to be handled first. And then we can sit down and have these arguments across the kitchen table about what the policy.
Well, I think instead of
any policy, if we don't save democracy.
Yeah, well, policy is for governance, and policy has a place, and I'm happy to think about it and talk about it and see what works and what doesn't and what's efficient and what isn't. That's really important. Talking about those things, but you're talking about campaigning. And I think, I don't know what the alternative or what the message necessarily is, but it seems that sometimes the Biden campaign and Democrats in general do a pretty good job at just using their opponent's words. Like sometimes you just take a video of Marjorie Taylor Greene, as the Biden campaign did, and put it out there. And about her comments with Biden, I think, supporting unions or something, or about, I forget which ones they use, but sometimes it's just take their words and just record them and share them with people. And if that don't scare you, then nothing else will.
Absolutely right. And the union point would be one of the areas where I think Biden, that doesn't necessarily speak to what policies he's implementing or behind. But if you have a president that walked a picket line, he's the first ever to do that. And we have recent polling that shows 70% of Americans now support labor unions. That's the highest that it's been.
Wow, I did not see that.
That I can remember. There was Rachel Maddow talked about it last night. That among those polling data that are being talked about, one thing that's being ignored is this significant bump in support for labor unions. So make that point, right? That's a bread and butter issue that you can talk about. But why? Because it doesn't just speak to bread and butter issues like wages and benefits. It also speaks to this notion of democracy, the right to protest for better conditions, and supporting people when they stand up for themselves. Like that is the kind of message that you want. You've got peaceful protesters on picket lines versus rioters at the Capitol on January 6th. There's a pretty good contrast between what those folks do when they're upset about something and what the Biden administration has thrown their weight behind when people are upset about something, whether it's wages or working conditions for people in SAG or the UAW or whatever it is, UAW in the case of Biden. So I think that message resonates because that's actually standing up for people and standing up for a system of small d democracy. And so I suspect they'll pivot and they'll figure out how to frame that. But there's no way to understand those polls that show him losing at this point in those key states, and especially the parts that say black and brown folks are abandoning him and young people are abandoning him. Yeah. They might be flirting seriously with not voting. I will give you that. I think there are a lot of young people who are flirting with not voting. I suspect there are increasing numbers of black and brown folks who may also be increasingly cynical about the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. But the idea that they're going to go vote for Trump as a result of that, which is what some of this poll would suggest, it just doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, you're referring to this latest poll. Didn't it say that black voters are increasingly moving to Trump and away from Biden?
I mean, that's what one of the polls at least suggested.
Is there any way to... I anecdotally talked to listeners know the ladies from the Hue, 4 black women. I'll air that within the week here somewhere. I got to edit it up real nice for everybody. But they were all like, no, we don't hear this. It's anecdotes. And they're talking about data in that poll. But I can't understand how that could be given. I just don't understand how that could be.
Well, I mean, look, there is some evidence that black folks and Latinos, and particularly men in those two groups, have gone in some statistically significant way toward Trump and toward the Republicans in the last 2 cycles. But you have to understand 2 things. Number one, black and brown men vote at lower levels than black and brown women, who still tend to trend more progressive and more likely to vote for Democrats. And secondly, that trend is still not a stampede. We're talking about the difference between what I think black folks 8% maybe voted for Kerry. Yeah, I mean, Trump might get 14%, 15%. But the idea that he's going to get 18 or 20% is just almost fantastical. It's incredibly difficult to believe that when the campaign really begins and you actually see the kind of people who are lining up behind Donald Trump and the ability of the Democratic Party to point out and to emphasize the racially hostile rhetoric of this man and his previous administration, to say nothing of what the next one would be like, I doubt very seriously that those numbers are going to get any higher than that. So is there some movement? Sure. But at the same time, there has been a significant movement of white voters, particularly those with college degrees and above, toward the Democratic Party, which in a lot of states, sort of counterbalances that. So I just think it's a poll that's way too early. It's a poll where the crosstabs, if you look into them, demonstrate very clearly that any conviction of Donald Trump on any of these counts is likely to flip the outcome. There's just a lot of work to be done. And I realize it's worth worrying about. But if people are worrying about it, thinking, oh, my God, we got to get rid of Biden and have somebody else run. Look, I would have preferred a different candidate, to be honest. And I would have preferred that a couple of years ago, Biden say, you know what, I came in here to save democracy from that asshole, and I'm going to step aside after one term. I know a lot of people will say that's a bad strategy. I wish he had done it. He didn't. Now we are where we are. And I understand the calculus of not changing horses in midstream at this point, because with only a year to go, I'm not sure any other candidate could raise the money, could, get the support, and it might look like an act of desperation. If they were to move off Biden now, after this poll comes out, it would look like panic, and that wouldn't particularly play well with the public. So we're sort of where we are, and people may not like it. Look, I'm angry at Biden about a whole lot of things. I'm very upset about the way Biden has handled Palestine. I'm very upset about the way that he's handled the bombing of Gaza and just not being willing to believe the numbers of how many have died in Gaza because, I just don't trust those numbers because Hamas is the one publishing those numbers. I don't appreciate that kind of rhetoric, but I also know, as someone who is deeply concerned about the bombardment of Gaza and the near genocidal policies that are being carried out by the Israeli government right now in that area, that nothing that the Republicans would do would be any better for the people of Palestine. And we know that Donald Trump will just send Jared Kushner over there to fix everything, which he did such a great job of before, where he just ignored the Palestinians altogether. They got these side agreements with other Arab states and ignored the entire question of the Palestinian people. So it's not going to be any better with anyone other than Biden at this point.
I'm forced to remind listeners, Jared Kushner, when he was a young man, Bibi Netanyahu slept in Jared Kushner's bedroom. Not with Jared Kushner. He was a guest of the Kushners. Bibi Netanyahu slept over in Jared Kushner's race car bed. That last part, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what I'm assuming.
I'm pretty sure. At least the top bunk.
Jared, is this your race car bed? I think we have audio of Bibi asking Jared, all right, let me ask you about one more really big, important issue I know you've been following. Of course, you live there in Tennessee, and back in March, there was a horrific shooting at a private elementary school by a woman who identified as transgender. She took the lives of 3 children and 3 staff members. And we talked about it at the time and the controversy surrounding what her motivations may or may not have been. Obviously, the gun issue, the school itself, why it was a target. We talked about that with you. You've been paying attention in this story. But yesterday, Steven Crowder, the right-wing, I don't know what he is. I don't want to give him any credibility in any way, but he and now other organizations have gotten their hands on the writings. I refuse to call them manifesto. Giving credit to these people is not something I want to do, much less say their name, those who commit these crimes, the shooters themselves. But I know you have a lot of thoughts about, nuanced thoughts about this. The question obviously is, should the public know the motivations of a shooter? Should we see their essays? And I can argue it both ways. The more you put it out there, the more it spreads the word, whether it be Anders Breivik in Norway, who may give a lot of credit. The Christchurch shooter in New Zealand gave him credit. Others have been obviously inspired and committed copycats. What are your thoughts on the manifesto, how it got out? Clearly, it was a photograph taken by a police officer, you're saying, and those who would use it and cherry pick from it, of course, to prove larger points, create divisiveness, and get ratings and sell advertising.
Right. Well, first off, it's not a manifesto.
Right.
A manifesto has prose and content and analysis and argumentation. Right. This is a journal, assuming it to be legitimate, and I'm going to assume for the sake of argument it's genuine and authentic. It is a journal that this shooter wrote in various thoughts. It is many, many, many pages long, but the presumably police officer who appears took pictures of this with the intention of eventually leaking them, and then did to, of all people, the journalistic, avatar of journalistic integrity known as Steven Crowder, only took 3 pages worth of pictures, which is to say that either the other pages didn't have any kind of political or ideological material on them, or they did, but it was so jumbled and so bizarre that all it really would have pointed to would be profound mental illness, which this shooter apparently suffered from. And that's what all the evidence we had prior to now suggested. But this individual took the pictures of these 3 pages because on those pages, this shooter had written things like killing crackers, killing people with white privilege that go to fancy schools and wear khaki pants or something. I don't know.
The shooter was white, no?
And the shooter's white. So, but what they were trying to do was to link the motive to some anti-white bias, which is fascinating because keep in mind, of the people that this shooter killed, one was a black security guard. So if in fact this was meant as an anti-white hate crime, literally the first person that the shooter killed was not white. Secondly, this person had targeted, according to the reports we had previously from the police, had targeted a mall, was thinking about going to the mall and shooting it up. Not just this school where everyone has, private school privilege, one of the things that was talked about on those 3 pages. So it's not a coherent manifesto or clarity in terms of what the motive is. But here's the really important thing. J.D. Vance and others yesterday were saying, see, this was about the belief in white privilege, the idea being that it's critical race theory or it's anti-racist analysis that created this shooter. And they're trying to draw a parallel between that and the obvious manifestos that were in fact written in the case of the El Paso shooter, in the case of the Buffalo shooter, in the case of the Jacksonville shooter, in the case of Anders Breivik that you mentioned in Norway, in the case of Dylan Roof. He had written lots of things online that indicated a really clear motive. This shooter in Nashville had a web page, had a Facebook page with their art display because they were going to art school, I think, at the time, and no political content at all, no ideological content at all, the way there were in those other cases. So you can't draw a parallel. Is this person angry at that school? Well, yeah, apparently they went to that school at one point. They attended that school. And I should point out, they attended that school many years ago when we now know, those of us who followed the story here in Nashville, that there was sexual abuse of children taking place at that institution. So did this shooter perhaps have a personal motive of revenge against the school? Well, who knows? If so, that might be on one of the other pages, but the cop didn't take a picture of that, and Steven Crowder didn't care about that because he just wants to make it about anti-racism. It's clearly a cynical use of cherry picking information to say this was the motive. You don't have, there's no indication, there's no ideological thread that is clear through any of this. This is a trans man, I guess, would be how he would identify, right? Who called other people the F word, anti-gay slur, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of ideological mishmash in this thing, which is one of the reasons the cops didn't want, and when I say the cops, I mean the larger Metro Nashville police, didn't want to release it because it was going to create more questions than it was going to provide answers.
Yeah.
And Steven Crowder, this is some type of PR coup that'll take people's attention not only off of Trump's problems, but off of Steven Crowder verbally abusing his wife 5 months ago, which we all saw. That was, displayed all throughout the internet, what an asshole he is. So we can forget about how he abuses women with his, hateful words, and instead talk about what this shooter apparently did and why, which we really still don't know.
Steven Crowder also has been accused by several former coworkers, I think, and maybe even current coworkers, of taking his dick out a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Very normal behavior. Very normal behavior. And the kind of person whose interpretation of journal entries we should completely rely upon. Right. And here's the most dishonest thing about it, and this is the important thing, too. Not only is it different from those right-wing manifestos that we saw before. And by the way, I'm not just saying if you happen to seem to have right-wing politics that I'm going to always ascribe it to that. There are other shooters in the past who have had some sort of reactionary meanderings in a journal, but I didn't make that, and none of us did make that about ideology. The guy that shot Gabby Giffords out in Arizona, if you'll remember him, Jared Loeffner, I think was his name. He was clearly schizophrenic. Did he have some writings which suggested reactionary motivation? Maybe, but we didn't speak about it that way because it was obvious that he was mentally ill.
There are plenty of people who commit horrible acts of violence, and we never find out, what the impulse was. But your point was still continuing, I think, about.
Yeah, it's just that you can't make a compare that when someone is clearly motivated by ideology, they are going to give you. In this day and age, they're going to do one of two things. They're going to have a clearly articulated manifesto. They're going to have Easter egg droppings all throughout, 4chan or Reddit or whatever. They're going to live stream it to some Twitch site that their followers can watch, where you go and you realize all the extremist content that's being put up there all the time. There's a lot of ways for ideologically motivated killers to make it real clear what their motivation is. And if you're killing on behalf of an ideology, you don't hide that. You make that real obvious. So if Audrey Hale, if this shooter in Nashville had really been operating on the basis of some weird, twisted, anti-white animus, which where did they learn that? At the Covenant Christian school that they attended previously?
I'm not sure that all of the motivation for anybody's actions matters, especially when they're committing a crime. And we should think about what we can do to change our culture and our laws. But the commonality with all these shooters, of course, is their accessibility to firearms. So, I mean, we can talk about winning hearts and minds, ideology, psychology, mental illness, all we want. But the bottom line is, and what Steven Crowder won't talk about and anybody else, is that these people, however they are, were able to get weapons that can kill a whole bunch of people.
Even if we were to accept the premise that there are left-wing folks, right-wing folks, other folks who act on the basis of their ideology to kill people, if it is harder to kill people, their hatred is not going to be as destructive. And the way you make it harder to kill people is you make it harder for people who feel that way, think that way, act that way, to get the weapons of war with which they then kill people. That is clearly the common thread. So even if we accept the argument being made, I mean, because what's the alternative? I mean, is J.D. Vance saying, is Steven Crowder saying, well, people who talk about white privilege now should be locked up as accessories to murder? Like, we're going to ban the discussion of white privilege? No, we can't. We're not going to do that. Just like, look, we're not going to stop the conversation about immigration policy just because Patrick Crusius went into that Walmart in El Paso and shot it up, and his manifesto talked about immigrants. That doesn't mean we're not going to talk about immigration. What I do hope it means is that we're not going to demonize immigrants, because that's the other difference. Those of us who talk about white privilege, which they're trying to make the link for this shooter in Nashville, we don't talk about, we don't say white people are evil because we have certain systemic advantages. The argument about white privilege is a sociological analysis about the society. It is a critique of the society, not the individuals who receive privilege. The right-wing critique of immigrants is a critique of them as dirty and criminal and rapists and drug dealers and people who cheapen our culture or who are coming to hurt you, in Tucker Carlson's infamous words, which he repeated dozens and dozens of times when he had his previous show. Those of us who are talking about white privilege and white supremacy are not talking about individual white people are awful and must be stopped. We are talking about a social structure that provides unearned and unfair advantages to people on the basis of their identity. It is a fundamentally different argument. And it cannot be considered linked to what an individual then does when they go out and happen to kill some white people, especially when they're white. Makes absolutely zero sense.
And there is you don't have to feel guilt about understanding that premise, that ideology, that sociological structure, economic structure. It gives you a tool, resources to try to change that paradigm as a result of your privilege. And you can say a lot more articulate things than I can on that. And you've written about them in entire books. Let me ask you before you go, I guess got to ask you, real quick, this is Mike Jones, the speaker. I've been talking a lot about Christian nationalism. I talked about it with you years before. I've been talking about it with all these other folks. I've been talking about it with this week, Andrew Seidel and Amanda Tyler yesterday and Monday here on the program. But this Mike Jones guy, this video came out where he's talking about as a religious app that is a watchdog of your online behavior. And that you set up an accountability group with another person, and just in case you watch porn. And my weird question is, are you interested in doing it with me? Because if you're getting anything done, productive wise, I'm telling you, I'm going to be real problematic for you, sir. You're going to be getting a lot of pings over here. You'll get nothing done with with every image that I look at that's unsavory. And also he shared it apparently with his son. I don't believe this. I'm going to go ahead and say I'm missing something. Have you heard about these apps before this?
Yeah, I heard about I think the very same one that they used when I watched this documentary on the Duggars the other day. Right. And it clearly worked so well for Josh.
Josh Duggar was on that app, and he then assaulted underage girls.
Well, he had already assaulted members of his own family. He had already committed the actual assaults at that point, but he also had child porn on his computer. So whatever this app is, clearly the youngsters know how to work around it.
Yeah, maybe he only had the app on one device, and then he had his dirty, filthy crime committing device.
Right. And that's the problem. These kinds of apps or these accountability structures or these blocker, technologies. Look, young people are way more adept than the old folks who are building these apps to keep their kids from seeing breasts. Yeah. Like, let's just be honest. I know, look, I am not a fan of young people looking at pornography. I realize it warps people's perceptions of sexuality and everything else. But this idea that young people who can figure out every workaround to turn off their GPS so their parents can't track them, they can figure out every possible workaround. You think they're not going to come up with a workaround to find porn? Obviously, I'm guessing Josh Duggar, did what a lot of other people in that situation have done, is they figure out the workaround. So we just, but it speaks, I guess, to the way that fundamentalists think about this stuff, that if you just either pray, it's the same people that say if you pray, your addictions will go away. If you just pray on this or you pray on that, your problems will go away. By the same token, if you just have an app, if you have an accountability buddy, everything will be fine. And it just doesn't really ever work out that way. If you have a problem with the way that pornography represents sexuality, then have that conversation. That's a conversation that people can have. That's a conversation that good people can disagree about. But when you cast sexuality as an issue of moral weakness, or you cast, really, let's be honest, they're worried about, Mike's worried about his son masturbating, I guess, because that's evil. You're not supposed to lust for anyone.
Yeah, I don't know why they need
who you then will call mother after you marry her, like this. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the problems with purity culture. Because what we've seen with purity culture, whether it's these filters for porn or whether it's, purity rings and purity balls, that
promise keeper, I will not.
All of that stuff, all of that purity stuff, A, it doesn't work. And B, it really instills a significant amount of shame in young people, right? If you're a young person and you have sexual thoughts, which, it happens, that's part of what adolescence brings to the fore when you're growing up. If you have been told that makes you evil and impure and dirty, you're going to internalize the kind of shame, which isn't going to keep you from acting out in any particular way that you might want to act out, but it's going to make you hate yourself, detest yourself, judge yourself in a way that isn't healthy after you act out, at which point now you think you're just a broken, awful person, rather than understanding that you're a normal person with normal thoughts and normal impulses that needs to have somebody who they can talk to about those thoughts and desires, not judge them for those thoughts and desires.
So well said. I mean, I've talked about it many times before and in my stand-up act, but it is true. The shame that I felt at the beginning of adolescence when I discovered masturbation was that the shame was around touching myself. So I, like a lot of other people, got really creative. And if you want to have any sympathy for inanimate objects, I mean, I made sweet love to everything soft.
Wow.
Yeah, okay. But because I was afraid to touch myself because there was shame. It was me. It was me touching myself. Shame. And it wasn't, by the way, my parents. I don't know where. I think it came from the church, Catholic Church or whatever. Yeah, but I was like, whatever. I think about that and I want to shake that kid. I'm like, go ahead. Give it a ride. It's yours.
Right. And being led to believe that sexuality is this dirty thing or this satanic thing or this thing that, you know, you're not supposed to have any of these thoughts and you're not supposed to even hold hands or kiss or anything until you're married, which is big in purity culture. That's not a healthy way to grow up. And I don't mean to condemn anyone's religious beliefs, but the problem is that kind of repression of natural human sexuality is we know from the research in psychology and just a little bit of common sense is intensely destructive to the vast majority of people who were exposed to it. It doesn't lead to healthy, normal relationships.
The damage it does to the furniture. I mean, like, if people knew. Don't sit there, Ma. I'm sorry. Too far.
I wasn't ready to play straight man to you today, so I didn't come up with any good.
I was going. I did pre-script the idea that you and I were on the Covenant app together. That was the only bit I had thought about, and that
was good. I wish I had predicted that was coming. Then I
invited you. You turned down my invitation. Tim Wise, do you want to be Pete Dominic's Covenant app accountability partner? No, and lose my number. I think was your message.
No, I was just afraid it was somebody trying to scam me out of my money with some phishing scam.
Fair enough. Well, another issue that these things often can create unnecessarily and needlessly. All right. Thank you so much, my friend. Awesome. As always, so appreciate your brilliance.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Sorry for the honesty and graphic nature of that description there at the end, but you may have heard it before. And it's true. It's serious. And I hated that. I felt that way. And I think it's, a sad and stupid thing to do to young people. Tim Wise, everybody, though, always awesome. That's it for today's program. A lot of work put into it. I hope you appreciate it. Tell your friends. Subscribe if you haven't already at patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Pay more if you'd like. We have not had any new subscriptions in far too long. It's been, I think, 2 weeks. It's a long stretch, so I'd love to see a new subscription or 2 or 20 come in, because while the show's free, it ain't cheap. Can't do it without you. So sign up now. Give it a rating and review. Spotify, iTunes, follow on YouTube, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, Facebook, and all of the rest. I'm everywhere trying to keep this train on the road, build our community, and learn together with each other each and every day. All right, John Carroll sings us in. He sings us out. He is a Grammy Award-winning singer and songwriter. JohnCarroll.org. Take it away, brother.
They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.